4 minutes after takeoff, the Airbus A380, the largest passenger plane ever built, turned into a flying bomb. An engine didn't just fail. It exploded. Shrapnel sliced through the wing like a shotgun blast through aluminum foil. Fuel gushed into the air. Hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere. And 469 people were about to find out if the world's most advanced aircraft could actually handle its worst nightmare. November 4th, 2010. Singapore. The Super Jumbo sat at Changi Airport, looking every bit like the engineering miracle it was supposed to be. 2 decks, 4 engines, 525 tons of metal and ambition. Qantas Flight 32 was heading to Sydney, and everything seemed routine. Captain Richard Champion de Crespigny was at the controls. He had 35 years of flying experience and over 15,000 hours in the air. The kind of pilot who'd seen everything. Or so he thought. 6 crew members were up front today. That's right, 6. Not the usual 2 or 3. The A380 was still relatively new to Qantas, so they had extra pilots aboard for training and supervision. Captain de Crespigny, First Officer Matt Hicks, Second Officer Mark Johnson, then 3 Czech captains observing and training. That cockpit was more crowded than a New York subway at rush hour. But this overcrowding? It was about to save everyone's life. At 10:01 a.m. local time, the thrust levers went forward. The Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines, each one generating 70,000 pounds of thrust, spooled up. The A380 weighs as much as 65 adult elephants, but those engines made it look graceful. The plane rolled down the runway, picked up speed, V1, rotate, and just like that, 469 souls lifted into the Singapore sky. 4 minutes later, everything went sideways. The plane was passing through 7,000 feet when passengers heard it. A boom. Not subtle, not ambiguous. A sound so violent that people in the cabin thought they'd been hit by a missile. Some thought a tire had exploded. Others were convinced they'd collided with another aircraft. None of them were even close to the truth. Engine number 2. The inboard engine on the left wing had just suffered what's called an uncontained engine failure. And yeah, that's exactly as bad as it sounds. A turbine disc, a massive spinning wheel of metal that rotates at over 10,000 RPM, had disintegrated. Not cracked, not broken, disintegrated. Pieces of superheated metal weighing several pounds each were flung outward at supersonic speeds. The engine casing, designed to contain exactly this kind of failure, didn't stand a chance. Shrapnel tore through the wing. It sliced through fuel lines. It severed hydraulic systems. It punctured the leading edge. One chunk later found to weigh 88 pounds, punched clean through the wing and embedded itself in the flap mechanism. Another piece shot forward and damaged the fuselage. Debris rained down on the Indonesian island of Batam, below. A piece even went through the roof of an elementary school. Luckily, it missed the kids. But up in the air, the A380 was hemorrhaging. In the cockpit, alarms screamed. Not 1 or 2, dozens. The electronic centralized aircraft monitor, the ECAM system that's supposed to calmly guide pilots through problems, lost its mind. Messages flooded the screens faster than the crew could read them. Master warning. Engine fire. Fuel leak. Hydraulic failure. Flight control degradation. The list went on. And on. And on. Captain de Crespigny looked at his instruments. He had 58 separate system failures staring back at him. 58. On the world's most advanced airliner. The engineers at Airbus had run millions of computer simulations. They'd tested every conceivable scenario. But this was off the charts. No one had ever imagined this many simultaneous failures. The computers didn't even have a checklist for it. Here's where things get interesting. That crowded cockpit, the one with 6 pilots crammed in, suddenly it didn't seem so crowded. Captain de Crespigny made a decision. He assigned each person a specific role. One pilot would fly the plane. Another would manage the engine fire. A third would handle the fuel situation. The Czech captains would work through the emergency checklists and calculate landing data. It was less of a cockpit and more of a crisis management war room. And they needed every single person. The engine fire was the immediate problem. Standard procedure is simple. Shut down the engine. Watch the fire go out. Except the fire didn't go out. They hit the extinguisher button. Nothing. Hit it again. Still burning. The fire in Engine 2 refused to die because the engine itself was so catastrophically damaged that the fire suppression system couldn't reach the flames. They had a blowtorch attached to their wing, and there was nothing they could do about it except watch it burn and hope the wing didn't melt. Meanwhile, fuel was streaming out of the left wing at an alarming rate. The A380 carries up to 320,000 liters of fuel. That's 84,500 gallons. Enough to fill about 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. And a significant portion of it was now spraying into the atmosphere. The fuel system is designed with redundancy. Multiple tanks. Multiple feed lines. But the shrapnel had punched through so many systems that the computers couldn't even figure out how much fuel was left or where it was. The automated fuel balancing system that normally keeps the plane stable had failed. Fuel was pooling in some tanks and draining from others. The plane was getting heavier on one side. The flight controls were equally messed up. The A380 has 3 independent hydraulic systems, color-coded green, yellow, and blue, because apparently aircraft engineers missed kindergarten and needed the reminder. These systems power everything: flaps, slats, rudder, ailerons, landing gear. The explosion had taken out one system entirely and damaged another. They were flying one of the largest aircraft in the world with degraded controls and no idea if the landing gear would even come down when they needed it. Oh, and the left wing was still on fire. Just thought we'd circle back to that. Captain de Crespigny decided they weren't going to Sydney. Shocking. I know. They needed to get this crippled giant on the ground as fast as possible, and Singapore was right there. But you can't just land a broken A380 anywhere. Changi Airport has a long runway, good emergency services, and it was familiar territory. They declared a mayday. The tower cleared everything out of their way. But now came the really fun part, figuring out how to actually land this thing. The A380 has a maximum landing weight of 386 tons. Right now, even with all the fuel they'd lost, they were sitting at around 430 tons. That's 44 tons overweight. Land that heavy, and you risk collapsing the landing gear, blowing the tires, or triggering a structural failure that could break the plane apart. But dumping fuel wasn't an option. The fuel dump system was damaged. They couldn't jettison anything. They were stuck with the weight. The checklist for overweight landings is long and complicated under normal circumstances. But nothing about this was normal. The computers that calculate landing speeds, approach angles, and stopping distances weren't designed for this scenario. They were giving erroneous data or no data at all. So the check captains broke out the paper charts and started calculating by hand. Old school. Slide rules and math. Figuring out how fast to approach, how much runway they'd need, how hard the brakes could work before the tires exploded. They had another problem. A big one. The anti-skid braking system on the left main landing gear was dead. That's the system that prevents the wheels from locking up during braking. Without it, if they applied too much brake pressure, the tires would skid, overheat, and potentially explode. And remember, they're landing 44 tons overweight with a wing on fire. Exploding tires would be the cherry on top of this nightmare Sunday. For almost an hour, the crew worked the problem, communicating with Qantas operations, running calculations, testing the flight controls to see what worked and what didn't, briefing the cabin crew on the situation. They told the flight attendants to prepare for an emergency evacuation, but didn't tell the passengers yet. No point causing a panic when they still had work to do. Down in the cabin, passengers knew something was very wrong. The explosion had been loud enough to hurt ears. People near the windows on the left side could see the engine, or what was left of it. The cowling was gone. Metal was twisted, and the thing was still glowing red hot. Some passengers were praying. Others were writing goodbye messages to their families. A few were oddly calm, probably in shock, but everyone could feel it. This wasn't normal turbulence or a minor mechanical issue. This was life or death. An hour and 47 minutes after the explosion, they were finally ready to attempt a landing. The longest 2 hours of everyone's lives. Captain de Crespigny briefed the cabin, told them to brace, told them where the exits were, told them that after landing they might need to evacuate quickly. The emergency services at Changi were standing by. Every fire truck and ambulance they had was staged along the runway. The tower had cleared all other traffic. It was just Flight 32 and the ground, about to meet under less than ideal circumstances. The approach was delicate. The flight controls weren't responding normally. The plane wanted to drift left because of the weight imbalance. The pilots were fighting it constantly, making tiny corrections, keeping it stable. They couldn't afford to come in too fast or too slow. Too fast, and they'd eat up runway and possibly blow the tires. Too slow and they'd stall and drop like a rock. The margin for error was non-existent. The runway at Changi is 13,000 feet long. That's 2.5 miles. Under normal circumstances, plenty of room for an A380. But they were overweight, had degraded brakes, and needed to stop this beast without destroying it. They aimed for the touchdown zone. Focused, precise. The main gear kissed the runway. Not a bounce, not a slam. A kiss. Textbook. Captain de Crespigny immediately deployed the thrust reversers on engines 1 and 4. Engines 2 and 3 were unusable. Siguriel is Dimian Su, and engine 3 had been shut down earlier as a precaution because of damage. The reversers screamed. The brakes engaged carefully on the right side, gently on the left to avoid skidding. The plane decelerated. Slower than normal because they couldn't use full braking power. They rolled and rolled and rolled, eating up runway. The tower watched. The emergency crews watched. The passengers held their breath. About 3,000 feet from the end of the runway, the A380 came to a complete stop. They were down, but they weren't done. Engine 2 was still on fire, still burning. Captain de Crespigny looked at the engine instruments. The fire had been going for almost 2 hours now. He tried the fire suppression system again. Nothing. But it was intense. And they were sitting on a runway with tens of thousands of pounds of fuel still in the tanks. The evacuation alarms hadn't been triggered yet because the fire trucks were already spraying foam on the engine. But if that fire spread to the wing fuel tanks, everyone needed to get off immediately. The pilots made the call. Partial evacuation. Passengers on the right side of the aircraft would disembark normally via stairs. Passengers on the left side near the fire would stay put for now. The fire crews were drowning the engine in foam. They finally got it under control. Only then did they evacuate the left side. Not a single passenger was injured in the evacuation. No panic. No chaos. Just 469 people extremely grateful to be alive. The post-flight inspection revealed the full horror of what had happened. The engine hadn't just failed. It had essentially exploded from the inside out. The turbine disc that disintegrated was made of a nickel alloy designed to withstand extreme temperatures and stress. But during manufacturing, the disc had developed a fatigue crack, so thin it was undetectable by the inspection methods used at the time. Over hundreds of flight cycles, that crack grew. 2010, it finally gave up. The disc shattered, and everything went to hell. The shrapnel damage was extensive. Over 650 holes in the left wing alone. Multiple fuel tanks punctured. Hydraulic lines severed. Flight control cables damaged. The wing's leading edge slat was destroyed. Part of the flap mechanism was obliterated. A section of the wing skin had been peeled back like a tin can. One of the landing gear doors was shredded, and an 88-pound chunk of turbine disc was embedded in the flap track. The plane would have exploded in mid-air. No one would have survived. The investigation by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau took years. They examined every piece of debris, analyzed the flight data recorder, interviewed the crew, studied the engine manufacturing process. The turbine disc had been manufactured with a misaligned oil feed stub pipe. This misalignment caused abnormal stress during operation, which led to the fatigue crack. Rolls-Royce issued a recall. Engines were inspected. Procedures were changed. And the A380 fleet was temporarily grounded for inspections. But here's the thing. The plane did its job. Despite 58 simultaneous system failures, despite an uncontained engine explosion, despite losing hydraulics and flight controls and fuel systems, the A380 stayed in the air. It stayed controllable, and it got everyone home. That's not luck. That's engineering. The redundancy built into the aircraft, the multiple backup systems, the over-engineered structure, all of it came together when it mattered most. And the crew. Captain Richard Champion de Crespigny and his team didn't panic. They didn't freeze. They worked the problem. 6 pilots in a cockpit that normally holds 2, dividing responsibilities, communicating clearly, making decisions based on data and experience. They flew that crippled plane for nearly 2 hours, calculating approach speeds by hand, testing degraded controls, managing an engine fire that wouldn't go out, and then landing 44 tons overweight on a runway, with minimal braking capacity. And they made it look almost easy. The passengers had no idea how close they came. If the shrapnel had hit just a few inches to the right, if the fuel tanks had ignited, if the wing spar had been damaged, if the landing gear hadn't deployed, if the pilots had panicked or made one wrong decision, there are 1,000 ways this story ends in tragedy. But it didn't. Because when everything went wrong at once, the people and the machine did everything right. Qantas Flight 32 never made it to Sydney that day. But everyone who boarded that plane in Singapore walked away. And in aviation, that's called a success. Registration VHOQA was eventually repaired after 18 months and over $100 million in work. It flew again. But the lessons from that day, the split-second decisions, the crew coordination, the engineering that held together when it absolutely had to, those lessons are still being studied and taught to pilots around the world. Next time you board a plane and hear the engine spool up, remember that behind those turbines are layers of redundancy, thousands of hours of testing, and crews trained for the absolute worst. Because sometimes, 4 minutes after takeoff, everything explodes. And somehow everyone still makes it home.